So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. I'm Carolina Alberna, CEO at the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce based in Toronto, and I'd like to welcome everyone to a very special BCCC ESG Excellence Series to talk about COP26 and what happened in Glasgow, featuring 5 senior executives who were in Scottish soil for the past 2 weeks. So the discussion will be moderated by Rafael Benke, CEO at Proactiva and chair of the BCCC ESG Committee. And so thanks for joining us here today. I'd also like to welcome then our speakers today, Katie Sullivan, Executive Director at IETA, International Emissions Trade Association, Greg McNab, Partner at Baker McKenzie, Anna Cabral-Gardner, Co-Chair and Co-CEO at Sigma Lithium, Rodrigo Lima, CEO at Agroicone, and Natalie Unterstell, President at Talanoa, the International Institute for Public Policy. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us in such a last-minute event. So before I call Rafael and the panelists, I'd just like to remind everyone that speakers will be available for questions. So please don't be shy and add any questions you might have in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. Just a quick acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge here as well the presence of Luciano Souza, partner at Siscon Bahia and vice chair of the BCCC ESG Committee. So for those who are not familiar with the BCCC, we're a membership-based association that supports its members through information, networking, and advocacy. And for nearly 50 years, we've been building relationships between Brazil and Canada, strengthening the bilateral relationship in investment, trade, best practices, and mutual growth and prosperity. Our relationships are public and private, featuring managing directors and decision makers from companies of all sizes. And our volunteer board of directors has expertise, knowledge, and connections that can only be found by being active players in the Brazil-Canada market. Our ESG committee was created to be a forum for high-level executives focusing on discussing strategic aspects related to ESG, to become a vehicle to strengthen and connect Brazil-Canada best practices to global initiatives, brainstorm ideas and network through knowledge sharing and knowledge building. So if you wanted to learn more on how to be part of the BCCC, how we can support your company, and how to become a member of our ESG committee, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our speakers today and pass the mic to Rafael, who will be our moderator. Thanks for being here again, and I'm looking really forward to this conversation. Rafa, stage is yours.
Great, thank you, Carolina, for the introduction. And I think we have a fantastic panel, and thank you all for responding so promptly to our invitation. I'm sure all of you are very busy catching up after the 2 weeks in Glasgow, and also all the follow-ups coming from that and everything that you had to suspend to be there. So thank you so much to be this hour with us. First decision we had to make about this panel is either we would read the bios of everyone here and then use the full hour because everybody here has a fantastic itinerary of life, and but I think we all want to talk about what is impacting our planet, and how relevant or not COP26 was for this journey of avoiding the catastrophic effects of climate change. So we will have this panel. We will try to have an interactive discussion amongst the panelists. We sort of shared amongst us here in preparation for this call some of the angles that we wanted or another person to bring forward according to his or her expertise. So the idea is that we come back and forth with the panelists so that we have a bit of a dialogue, and it becomes more entertaining for everyone. And chiefly what we want to focus is really what happened from October 31st to November 12th in Glasgow, not only related to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the progress on its tax commitments, ancillary documents, and so on, but but what happened also as satellites of commitments and movements and deployments in the private sector, in civil society, and so on. And I think we have the right people to address this from different angles, from civil society, from private sector, for different sectors of the economy, and we will kick off with Katie, who I believe, Katie, you should have access to sharing of the presentation, or we'll count on Carolina for that. I believe you have a couple of slides you'd like to share, but we'll start with Katie. Then we'll go on to the other panelists. I will call each one, and we have more or less a lineup of speakers that we agreed on. But Katie, can we start with you, and you laid the foundations for our dialogue. So Katie, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rafael. Carolina, BCCC, thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad that we can make it work. I do have to leave early though, so I appreciate you accommodating me at the front end. And I promised to, as Rafael said, set the stage for a really great set of speakers who all bring fantastic insights from their vantage point. Brazil, Canada on the business side. Am I sharing my screen then? Is that, okay, this was I think it was my 12th COP. And when I arrived halfway through, so I missed some of the craziness around the World Leaders Summit at the beginning. But when I left my hotel room to head to the COP on the first day, I walked out, and on the tables in the hotel lobby, there were FT, Financial Times, and that day, there were ads at the front page by Suzano, big paper company, Brazil, that was a major call in huge, bold font for regulated carbon market. And that's what business wants and business needs. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, this is going to be a very different experience in COP. And in particular, it was just warmly embraced, the engagement by Brazil and the government, but also the businesses and the business voices. It was really quite remarkable. So what happened at COP? Yeah, it's a flurry. It's busy. We're all still digesting and doing tons of briefs. Next slide, please. And just for context with AIDA, we actually came out of the UN process. So like BCCC, AIDA is a membership association. We have members across the carbon value chain, big emitters, project developers, assurance providers, the greenhouse gas standards, financials, lawyers like Greg and Baker, and we bring a fairly heavy delegation every year to COP. So this year we had over 100 delegates. And we had a business hub pavilion with over 70 events that occurred. And in addition to that, we closely track all elements of the negotiations themselves, and in particular, Article 6, the markets rules, which I'll talk about a bit more. But in the lead up to COP26, there were lots of mixed emotions. Anxiety levels were high. Last time we were together was 2019 in Madrid, where there was still a lot of work that had to be done before a Paris Agreement really was implemented and became alive. And then obviously COVID hit, right? So lots of uncertainties. There were pressures that were mounting from all sides, including huge, powerful voices from youth and civil society that we saw on the ground in Glasgow at major protests. Lots of skepticism due to the limited amount of progress and the challenges that had occurred, even diplomatically, heading into Glasgow. When we heard that China, so President Xi and Putin were not planning to go, that curbed a lot of, enthusiasm. Could we actually see some success without those major players at the table physically in Glasgow? And then obviously just the nightmare logistics around COVID risks and testing and the exorbitantly high costs for hotel rooms and pavilion space. You had pre-COP, you had G20, there were a good movements and announcements, but still question marks about what actually was going to be achieved in Glasgow. And then that it started the first and second, of course, with the World Leaders Summit that saw a lot of big announcements, more NDCs, net zero commitments, including by Australia, UAE, Saudi Arabia. India was the big one with net zero by 2060, 70, and then Nigeria. And then you also had all this net zero corporate investor commitments, and that was over the course of 2021. It seemed like every day there was a new major big financial or corporate that was moving on net zero. But then you saw a lot more of that on the ground in Glasgow during the first week. And then again, for us in Article 6, we consider Glasgow the last chance really to get a clear, good rule book provide the guidance for international carbon markets. So in the end, we are, this is some of the data that came on around the targets and the net zero goals. And to date, we have 90% of the global GDP are now covered by net zero goals. So very significant, but it's extremely different in terms of the quality, right, and the type of those goals. So, and also most of the 2030 targets that have been put forward, including recently, we all know they're not strong enough to actually deliver on the net zero Paris Agreement goals. Caroline, next slide, please. So what did it deliver? And this is what we have been, working over the last 72 hours and unpacking and communicating to the group. But ultimately, the Glasgow Climate Pact, GCP, and it's a package that ultimately, responds to the code red warnings, the keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, or the pathway alive. But in the words of Alok Sharma, the UK presidency, it's alive, but it's on life support. There's still a lot to be done. So in Glasgow, there was confidence on actually delivering climate finance. And this is the 100 billion a year by 2020. That was not achieved, but there's now a commitment to achieve that $100 billion from developed countries to developing countries by 2023, doubling of the adaptation finance by 2025, the robust Paris rulebook, I'll speak to in a second a bit more. Also this brand new UN task force for ensuring environmental integrity and really providing the oversight of all the business pledges. So the non-state actor pledges, this is going to be interesting to watch. Still lots of question marks, but this is a new task force that will be operationalized over the coming year. And then increasing that ambition. So NDC increases again well short of the 2 degree, let alone the 1.5 degree, but the commitments are there. There's more on the table, and we're expecting to see updated more by next year, 2022. And then by 2025, it was agreed that all countries will update NDCs for 2035 timeline. And then you had sectoral transformation, all these other pledges that went on outside of the actual halls, negotiating circles. And then these acceleration packages, the stronger commitments to 1.5 aligned action, again, COP decisions revisiting net zero strategies and 2030 plus and beyond NDCs. Then there was loss and damage dialogue that didn't quite actually play out like some may have wanted. Next slide, please. So this was the flurry, and this is certainly not all of them, but it's some of the highlights of the multilateral and bilateral initiatives and pledges that were put forward. And there were a ton, and there were really, quite ambitious. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. It saw Canada and it saw Brazil and the EU and the US. I think around 141 countries signed on to the declaration. And it's around really driving deforestation down to 0 by 2030. The Global Methane Pledge, that was US, EU led. Brazil also signed on to this, as did Canada. And that's around driving methane emissions down by 30% by 2030. And then you had a bunch of these other initiatives initiatives, First Movers Coalition around hard to abate sectors, Just Energy Transition that really focused on over $8 billion mobilized or to be mobilized for South Africa around its energy transition as a possible model for other jurisdictions to follow. You had aviation, ZEVs, and declaration for green shipping. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, driven by Mark Carney, that got a lot of attention, of around 450 firms from around 45 countries that manage over 130 trillion in assets. But the message is that they're all committed to put those into green activities and investments. The resources are there, but what's missing are the clear rules and mechanisms to deploy. And then breakthrough agenda, coal to clean power transition statement. That was a lot on international coal financing and no new coal investments. And then, of course, the big, which actually came as kind of a surprise to many, but it was a welcome surprise, the US-China Joint Glasgow Declaration. And this is, it was a lot of the focus was on phase down of fossil fuels or unabated fossil fuels, and also methane was really captured clearly there. And of course, a China-US commitment to 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. Some of you have seen this already, and if not, you'll probably see it a lot in future briefings. But the Climate Action Tracker took stock of policies and actions now to date, and what that really, what that translated into around the degree Celsius temperature warming. Policies, actions, 2.7 degree, right, average, still not good. If you capture all 2030 targets, the NDCs alone, if they're achieved, we're still at only, 2.4 degrees, not good. Then they captured all of the additional pledges and targets. We get to 2.1, so the gap is narrowing to the below 2 degrees, 1.5, but we're still not there. Then an optimistic scenario at 1.8. So there's still a gap. We're getting there. Progress is made, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Next slide, please, Carolina, and I'll wrap shortly. So we have Glasgow Climate Pact. Again, firm basis for delivering on the Paris Agreement. Detailed reporting requirements and related support. You have robust rules for the carbon market. That's Article 6. Clear 5-year NDC ambition cycle. Like I said, it's going to be 2025 for 2035 updated NDCs, and then 2030 for updated 2040 NDCs. So now this clear 5-year ambition cycle, which is welcome. Climate finance pledges, which I already spoke to. That longer term ambition, focus on the 1.5 degree. Language, the political superstructure decision. This is the opening decision that you've never ever seen before around language with unabated fossil fuels. The phasing down, not phasing out, the phasing down of fossil fuels and inefficient subsidies. And then again, narrowing, or on track to narrowing that short-term emissions gap. Final slide, please. So just the Article 6, it's near and dear to our hearts as a business. Brazil really stepped up. They were recalcitrant in some of their positions around double counting or allowing for double counting and not doing corresponding adjustments when using international markets. They really changed their tune this year, and it was so welcome. It finally built that bridge to broker a deal, and it's a good and balanced deal around Article 6. So what we have is now guidance for robust accounting for international markets that link from the bottom up. And then you have 6.4, a brand new UN top-down centralized mechanism that will issue units over the coming years. They have to set up a supervisory board, establish methodologies, go through a whole process, but they will be issuing internationally transferred mitigation outcomes for countries to use to reach their NDCs. And again, there will have to be corresponding adjustments that are tagged to using these ITMOs as they are used for reaching their NDCs. So a lot of activity here on Article 6, a lot of work to be done on actually implementing it, not just at the international level, but also within countries. So engaging with businesses in Canada, in Brazil, with governments in Canada and Brazil and elsewhere to establish their policy frameworks and pursue these international cooperative approaches will be absolutely critical. And so actually a final slide, just looking at the road ahead. And then Rafael, I'll pass it back to you. So 2022, 2023, we have a major, couple of years of actually rapid start, Article 6, including CDM transition. COP27, we go to Egypt. COP28, we go to the UAE. That'll be the global stocktake in 2023. And then we're going to head back to somewhere in Eastern Europe in 2024, which is most likely going to be around a finance COP, because climate finance is going to be top of mind in 2024. And with that, I will hand it back to Rafael. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. So interesting. I don't know how many minutes you still have for your other event. Probably you have to run now, but I think it was particularly interesting on something we wanted to highlight already, which is the array of initiatives we could see in parallel to the UNFCCC discussions. So what you called, Katie, as multi and bilateral initiatives and pledges. So you listed a dozen here of the key ones, but there was so much going on, and I think we're going to hear more from the other speakers about it. And how much this, when you brought the climate action tracker, how much these pledges and targets, additional pledges and targets, also contribute to the overall goals that are being sought. So I think that was extremely interesting on what you brought. I think let's talk more, towards the end with the other speakers about the roadmap after that. I think how much, of what was consolidated on Glasgow, let's hear also from the other speakers, will take time for implementation. And you mentioned the role of Bonn in further developing the tools to be able to put together this centralized mechanism. So it would be interesting to explore that. But I think, well, Katie, if you have to jump out, please feel free. And I think we'll have a very interesting match now, follow up on what you said, coming from Greg McNab, because Greg has been following this also for a couple of months, right, Greg? I'm sure that from someone that also is looking this through the legal lenses and what we're consolidating and what are the impacts that these are bringing. I think Katie brought an interesting point, how much this is also framing better references step by step. I think there is, of course, the glass half empty that we'll hear soon, I'm sure. But Greg, if you could follow on this, and also if you could, Greg, bring some sectorial angles. How from we know you have clients in different sectors. How this impacted differently, maybe different sectors.
Great. Well, thanks, Rafael, and thank you, Katie, for setting the stage and sort of leading the discussion forward. It's a fitting introduction because, Rafael, you wouldn't know this, but on the business side, where most of our clients' concerns and comments come from, we've relied on our partnership with AIDA for decades now to hear that voice and just to be close to the conversation. And so it's a great. And so Katie was there for the second week. I was there for the first week. But most of the work we did there was through AIDA. and Katie's organization. So it's great to follow on this. Rafael, you used the expression of kind of glass half full, half empty. The other expression I heard was afterwards was one of the people there said it was a bitter pill for everyone to swallow, the final deal. So meaning that there was nobody walked away thinking it was a perfect deal for everybody. And everybody, I think, felt they'd compromised a little bit. But, before I just talk about a couple of the legal or regulatory concerns or comments that come out of it, it's quite an amazing concept if you think about it, that 120 heads of state and governments in 200 countries would all physically come together at the same place in the same time on the eve of or exiting a pandemic to talk about these problems and issues. It's quite remarkable, and so it probably speaks to the severity of the situation and hopefully to the overall commitment. But that also, I mean, the idea that this has happened, it's also important to remember, like when we talk about the commitments and the things that came out of COP26 that Katie just set out, like what does all that mean and why, like how does this work? Like what's the structure and how do all of these things now get implemented and come about? And so
Greg, let's go on this exactly. This point will be fantastic. I just wanted to break a little second, really, and Katie, we really need to go in a few seconds. I just wanted to really thank Katie very much for her time in being with us. We know how busy she is with the aftermath, and thank you so much for your contribution, Katie. And not only for the panel here, but all you've been doing in this arena. So again, thank you for jumping in, and look forward to seeing you again in other events that we'll probably develop. So
my pleasure. It was an honor to set the stage for such a fantastic set of speakers that hopefully I know that they'll provide additional insights. And I just really hope to work closely with all of you. We have a lot of work to do together, okay? A lot. So it's been my absolute pleasure, and let's just keep the lines open, okay, over the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Greg, for the interruption, please.
No, not at all. So it's important, so there is a legal process and a framework, or I would probably even say an organizational framework about how this all came about, starting with, but way back in 1992, and it's called COP26 for a reason. This was not the first one. And so this is part of an ongoing discussion and, an overall global participation. So this is the COP26 was other than COP15 in Copenhagen, which I was at as well. I haven't seen the level of intensity in the discussions since then. So, so there's a couple of things that are going to talk. Just want to mention that are going to feed into this, the idea of where do these legal commitments come from, and what does it all mean? So I mean, obviously we've got the countries involved, but the voice of youth in these discussions is now sort of bubbled up. It's been sort of coming along for a number of years, but it was part of this discussion. It was part of the process. It was part of the overall conference, and so that's going to be part of the assessment going forward when we commit to these different things. Is young people are having more of a say in it than we previously thought, and how does that commitment or how does that discussion happen with young people? But probably the most important thing to kind of take away when we think about what does this all mean from a legal framework is this really is kind of it's almost a synonymous ESG discussion, which is why it's such a great fit for this committee. I know it's, we talk about this was like a climate discussion, but it really was a climate plus people discussion. So, it's very much a discussion of, how the science has to adapt to, or help us adapt to these climate pressures. But, there's a bunch of different phrases that are used, but one of them is, for example, just transition. The idea is not just that we're going to throw money at science that's going to, make these changes and save the world. The idea is that we're going to put money to work in a way that not only makes sense from the science perspective, but from the people perspective. And so it protects some countries that don't have the funds to defend themselves against the impacts of climate. But it also is going to redirect finance and money into things that we as a society think are better investments for our long-term goals. So that sets the stage for a very complicated framework for all of these things to happen. So, you know, we've got those different pressures and different things bubbling away. And then you layer in probably the one last thing that I will say is kind of important to kind of how is all this going to result in actual outcomes? This is all, for the most part, a voluntary process. So, you know, we had all these countries show up and we had all these commitments, but we're all in this together in the sense that, you know, we're promising, and, you know, there's probably a joke in here somewhere about, you know, what's the value of a politician's promise, but I think the value of it in this case is that it's a politician's promise, but it has the weight of most countries behind it. So most people in these countries, they want their governments to do the right thing on this front. And so how does that all translate into, you know, pressures and legal commitments? And so some of that is going to, the way I sum it up is, it kind of for most businesses. And so, you know, for us, I think the most obvious industries that are directly impacted by the COP26 process and the outcomes from it are the resources companies, so mining, oil and gas, the large emitters that traditionally have been impacted. But so what came out of this for them? So as I just said, this is an ESG discussion that in part the mining and oil and gas sectors have actually been quite good at in improving their story. They just don't do a very good job of saying that because, you know, for years we thought it was just a negative story. But when you look at most companies, they've actually got a good story to tell. And so there's that side of it. There's this concept of, I mentioned youth a minute ago. And so but youth is in the larger bucket now of stakeholders. Stakeholders now means a lot more than it used to. And so for companies that are trying to figure out, you know, what pressures do I respond to, what commitments do I need to make, et cetera, you now have to listen to a broader audience. And so some of those are not legal pressures. They're not governments that can force you to do things. There are things like your shareholders, they're NGOs, you know, they're social media campaigns, you know, launched by, you know, some very vocal youth. So there's that pressure. You know, this discussion's all about money. It's about science and money, but we need the money to flow to the right places to make it work. And so for most of our clients, that the two changes that have happened there are regular capital, where they would normally go to some of these banks. Those lenders are now being pressured not to lend to certain types of projects. So regular capital has become more expensive, but on the other hand, green finance tools and alternative capital pools are becoming more available. So you've got the decision to you know, to get on board with this process because it'll transition you to a different capital base. Great. And then we get into things like you know, insurance changes there, and so for our companies in these sectors, they're finding it increasingly difficult if they're not on board with this transition and with this reduced risk profile. They're finding it very difficult for insurance.
Thank you, Greg. Let's come back to you soon. Sure. I just wanted to mention that on this last point you brought forward on the financial dimension of it. It will be interesting to hear from Anna very soon because I think she's in the middle of this turmoil, developing her business, which is a business that is also a pillar for the transition that we're talking about, because she produces essential raw materials for the new economy. We will hear from her. And on the other point you brought, I think we will hear from Natalie, I think an interesting perspective on not only on what's happening in Glasgow vis-a-vis climate itself, but the aspect of just transition and climate justice and all these components, as Natalie has been doing a terrific job in connecting people, connecting voices, and for years now. And I think she will bring really several standpoints that converge into these discussions. But before going to Anna and Natalie, I wanted to come to Rodrigo, because Rodrigo has been following the agribusiness sector in Brazil, trade negotiations, biodiversity, climate negotiations for 20 years in mine counting, probably more than that. But what he's been studying and working with in different capacities is so crucial in these discussions that involve Brazil and the global setting. And it will be very interesting to hear from him, especially on some developments we saw in Glasgow related to forests, related to methane, and anyway, in overall perspectives about it. So Rodrigo, what are your views? Let's have your snapshot, then we'll go to Anna, Natalie, and then we'll go back to everyone again to do our dialogue. So Rodrigo, your snapshot, please.
Thanks, Rafael and Carolina, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will start with taking advantage on some insights that Greg mentioned, all the economics behind the COP, because climate change meetings were not more just environmental people discussing how to save the world. It is extremely clear that we need finance. We need to change how finance flows to the different sectors to be able to tackle what Rafael just mentioned, a just transition. If you ask what is a just transition for several people, you will probably get different answers. And this is not tricky. This is not easy to manage and put together as to assemble the puzzle we are trying to manage in the past years. And I tend to believe that this Glasgow COP was extremely important on really trying to assemble this puzzle with this finance perspective so huge, and the failure of putting together $100 billion per year coming from developed countries as a failure at some extent, but as the need to advance this when it comes to adaptation and when it comes to loss and damage. I heard some people asking me, oh, this COP, let's forget about mitigation because now we need to have adaptation. We cannot forget about mitigation because otherwise we will not get to 1.5 degrees targets. But we need to work together and on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. But without finance, we will not work any of those pillars, and this is a huge challenge. So having said that, when it comes to agriculture and thinking about the sectors, I'll bring agriculture and land use because they're interconnected. And my perspective is that when it comes to agriculture and Brazil within all of this, and Canada as well, because it's a very important sector in Canada as well. But in my perspective, we have innovation as the basis when it comes to agriculture, mitigation, and adaptation. Without innovation, countries, whatever country, will not be able to transform their agricultural systems towards more resilient and sustainable, and if possible, to reduce emissions in their agricultural sector. So we have the agriculture mission for climate initiative, the aim for climate, that the bases are innovation. We have countries with their perspectives. Brazil presented the ABC Plus plan, aiming to reach 72 million hectares of new area, adopting technologies that will allow to reduce emissions up to 1.1 billion tons of CO2 up to 2030, and so on. And for Brazil, the whole technology is comprised in this strategy. It's quite relevant for the development of the sector, not just because the Paris Agreement, because if you don't do partial recovery, if you don't do integration, if you don't do no tillage, you will have problems reducing productivity and soil degradation and so on. So innovation is it's without this, no country can move on thinking about resilience and safeguarding agriculture to have food for everyone, as we saw at the Food System Summit and so on. So innovation it's one of the challenging things, and it opens a lot of space for financial, for private financing, and all the ESG debate on what should be financed and what are the criteria that needs to be in place to allow new private finance and so on, and as well as technology, the whole debate of technology to do that. The other side, in my perspective, and then I'll jump to Brazil, is the land use issue, because deforestation. Brazil, we have deforestation. It's increasing again from the past years. This is horrible in terms of the numbers. We are on average 11,000 kilometers per at the Amazon, and this is too much. We are lagging behind the target Brazil put to itself up to 2030, that we will reach a maximum of 3,900 kilometers and so on. And what happened in Glasgow, I think it's very paramount, because the declaration that more than 100 countries signed to really stop deforestation, cooperate to stop deforestation, having Brazil together is not new in terms of efforts, collective efforts. We have the New York Declaration on Forests. We have the Amsterdam Declaration. We have several declarations and approaches to this. But now we have Brazil on board, and in parallel, Brazil presented some insights that how to tackle illegal deforestation, with a target to 2028. And to be there in 2028, we will need to change a lot of things here in Brazil. And now we have today the European regulation to tackle deforestation on imported goods. And yesterday the WTO published the World Trade Report of this year, and there's a lot of deforestation there. And so this, and then we cannot forget that China and US declaration that was presented earlier, and we have the two biggest emitters of the world, China and US, together, saying that they will cooperate to address climate change, and they inserted illegal deforestation as something not acceptable. So how to manage this in terms of different chains that are producing and exporting and buying products, and trying to come up with transparent with transparent data and information that they are not producing, relying on deforestation in a big country such as Brazil. So, and then we have all the private finance that, of course, they want they do not want to have deforestation attached to the finance piece. So, despite that, all of these deforestation declarations and movements and so on are not decisions from the COP26. They are adopted on the moment of the COP, taking advantage of different countries being there and companies adopting net zero targets. There was several Brazilian companies from the agricultural sector at the COP26 presenting their cases and trying to highlight what they are doing to really detach from deforestation and managing and trying to control. So I think there's a movement going on, and this must evolve, especially because if the Brazilian government fails to tackle illegal deforestation, who will be in the spot will be the private sector, and they can suffer trade barriers, they can suffer investment barriers, they can suffer image, and we have big companies. We are talking about big companies, and so I think we have a different moment right now when it comes to this connection of agriculture, climate change. Rafael mentioned biodiversity. We follow biodiversity as well, and we are negotiating the biodiversity framework for that will be agreed next year in China. And again, there's a close connection. If you are deforesting to produce, you are causing damage to biodiversity as well as carbon. So this is a huge issue on the table, and how to manage this, how to create opportunities to agriculture when it comes to innovation and proving that you are not deforesting. There's the debate about legal and illegal, and this opens a huge agenda to work, and this requires attention from the government for sure, as well the private sector. And Natalie will probably touch upon some all the criticism and the role of the civil society towards this issue as well, because it doesn't matter if Brazil has a renewable energy matrix compared to developed countries. This is good. We need to improve a lot because we are suffering from energy as well. And okay, we can do a lot of good things, but it doesn't matter because we need to tackle deforestation. Otherwise, agriculture, the private sector will suffer for one big challenge that the government is not managing well. And we have millions of public non-designated land being deforested and just there, and the government doesn't take care of this. So this is huge. Yeah. And I think that Glasgow brought a lot of inputs on the importance to manage all of this. Thanks.
Yeah. That was very good, Rodrigo, and maybe I propose we revert and we just get Natalie going, and on the topic of deforestation, we just had became public the proposal for regulation on deforestation-free products by the European Commission. And Rodrigo reiterated several times the word illegal deforestation, and this legislation doesn't do any differentiation between legal and illegal. It's just tackling deforestation-free products, and the cutoff line is end of 2020. So if we don't learn what you're saying, Rodrigo, by as we say in Brazil, by love, we'll learn by pain, right? And anyway, we'll see a lot on this yet. But Natalie, maybe we just connect to what Rodrigo raised so many issues already, mentioning you. So just let's have you dovetailing to his chat, and then we wrap up with Anna and go to some Q&As.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure also being with Rodrigo and others here. I'm the president of Talanoa, which is a new think tank dedicated to climate policy in Brazil, but I've been observing the COPs, UNFCCC processes for a while, and have been a negotiator for Brazil myself for 5 years. So I think I cannot speak on behalf of civil society nor on behalf of our government, but I do kind of understand both points of view. And I just want to start by saying that as someone that was at COP26 observing the process and observing how Brazil got to Glasgow and how it left Glasgow as a delegation, I think we were successful in the sense that a lot of damages were minimized. And I think that's already a success. We've been, as Rodrigo said, for 3 years now in a very difficult situation. Deforestation became a systemic risk, not only to those that are in the agriculture sector, but also to other sectors in our economy. When our investors go abroad nowadays, independently if they are not even in the Amazon region, they have to answer questions about deforestation. So it's something that it's really hurting us and that we want to see control. So, and we know how to do it. So that there is this very strong call from Brazilian civil society, private sector, so on as governors, also to tackle this and to really consign deforestation to history in our case. So it was good to get to Glasgow and to see that actually there was a very strong presence from Brazilians. And I just want to mention the presence of 17 governors of state. I think that's a very impressive number. All of them left their states during the pandemic to really go there to state their commitments to this agenda. And but they didn't go there with their hands empty. Many of them went there with commitments, for instance, to phase down coal, to phase out coal, to tackle deforestation, to enter agreements with other states and nations to get climate finance to tackle deforestation. So I really saw a very concrete agenda around Brazil coming out of Glasgow. But I wanna make sure that I touch 2 points here. One is on the Glasgow Climate Pact from a broader perspective, and then a little bit more on how do we stand as Brazil after this. So just starting with a higher level analysis, I do see the COPs nowadays, and especially after Copenhagen and COP15, more as a scoreboard. So I don't see it as, the central body which is regulating things. It's much more like processes that are going around, especially after the Paris Agreement. And then we go to this conferences and see them as a landing point. And that's why I think it was so important to see that the Glasgow Climate Pact, in the end of the day, it was much more an accelerator of what is already going on in the world, and also reflection of the change of perspectives that are happening in reality. So it was very important to see that the focus shifted from 2 degrees to 1.5. Also to see that there was the global methane pledge signed by more than 100 countries, but also in the text, there is mention to methane. So we are moving from CO2 focus to a broader focus on methane and other non-CO2 gases. That's also very critical. And it was also interesting to see that the whole decision, it touches upon a pre-2025 agenda. So we're talking about the short term. We are talking about countries presenting better pledges next year, including Brazil. At least we expect so. So this is not anymore about, 2050 or very long-term promises, but something that has to happen during this decade, and that there is this ratcheting mechanism that was created within the Paris Agreement really working out. So I think that was very, very good to see. But now the point is, will countries really update their pledges, including the sectoral commitments? Will Brazil, for instance, when submitting a new NDC, a new nationally determined contribution, include methane, include a concrete zero deforestation pledge, not illegal, but zero deforestation, but because this is what it was the deal about. So all of these issues, I think they are up for each country to discuss and to really come up with concrete responses. But overall, my assessment of what came out of the negotiations is that it's very good. It's much better than what at least I was expecting. And it was really important that the COP26 presidency risked a lot to put all of these word reflections there. In terms of the Article 6, which was also a very important outcome, and we know that here in Brazil, I don't know what's the mood in Canada, but in Brazil, there are high expectations around Article 6. And of course, that contributing for, this, not a change, but this flexibility that our diplomacy showed in Glasgow. But in Article 6, I think that the main issue now is that in order to participate in any of these Article 6 mechanisms, some criteria were laid out, and they are very clear. So for instance, only countries that have ambitious and progressive NDCs will be able to participate. So there's a reference to Article 4.1. There are other mentions in the decision text that point to this, like countries will not participate only because they want, but they will have, to fulfill some criteria. This is one of this. Their NDCs will have to be progressive. They will have to be, in compliance with the Paris Agreement. I'm mentioning this here because today Brazil would not, fulfill this criteria and this criterion, and this is super important to us. Second point, you have to meet your NDC. You have to achieve everything that you are saying you're going to achieve. And this is, of course, what we want, right? We want countries not only to promise, to pledge, but to actually implement what they are saying. So this is another thing which is crucial, and that I'm going to talk a little bit and then finalize on the opportunities and risks around that in our case. And finally, the Article 6 also lays out the issue of governance. So because particularly for Article 6.4, countries will have a role to play in terms of authorizing private projects and applying corresponding adjustments. So each country will have to create a very strong governance domestically, of course, with technical expertise involved. So this will also, impose or call for internal arrangements. So these three criteria are super important. And in our case, the opportunity is the following. Brazil, if we get to 2030 with a radical reduction on deforestation, I'm not talking even about zeroing, but just like a radical reduction from the 10,000 level that Rodrigo spoke before to 6,000, which is not good enough, but a reduction. If we get that, if we do restoration and we adopt domestic pricing, we can reduce up to 66% of our emissions. So this was the work that we did, some scenarios that were constructed. I think Rodrigo participated of this process. There were 300 actors involved. So we can get to 66% without, at low cost, without the need of disruptive disruptive technology, and also being inclusive. And the point here is, if we do that, we already have opportunities to meet our NDC, to do everything else. But if we go even further and zero deforestation in the Amazon and in the Atlantic forest, we can get up to 82% of reductions. And the cost of the climate finance needed for that is really not a big deal. It's about 92 billion reais, which is less than, $2 billion, I think, per year during the whole decade. So it's possible, it's doable. And I really see that actors here want to do it. But what the risks are today? The risks are that we don't see a change in our NDC. So no change of tune domestically, although our diplomacy has changed tune. The other is that we don't do progressive NDC. So this is another risk. And as I said, that would impede our access to some of these mechanisms. And finally, we can get locked into low ambition. And that's my main concern, because some actors are seeing the Article 6 as, they are very afraid of the corresponding adjustments. And they say, okay, so let's, set our ambition very low, because everything else that we do, we use as a corresponding adjustment. I think that's a very, that's not a good, that's not a good train of thought. That's not what we need. We need high ambition in implementation, and then we can come up with, the adjustments needed in the NDC, in the inclusion of the private sector, so on and so forth. So I just want to close by saying that overall, what I heard in Glasgow and what I see as needed, both in Brazil and elsewhere, are these three things. We need to finance this transition, and it's, in our case, not a very, very difficult thing in the case of Brazil. Secondly, we need to transition finance, and I really see the financial private sector really engaged and really forthcoming in terms of doing that. And finally, climate justice. So everything that we do here and we do elsewhere, we have to take into account, like, who are the most vulnerable. They are going to be the ones that will judge if the Glasgow Climate Pact is successful or not. They are going to tell us, oh, okay, you did it. But this is not to be next year, nor COP28, COP29. I think by the end of this decade, we will have a clear picture. And I'm very confident, and I'm working toward a good outcome, a good assessment by them. Thank you.
Fantastic, Natalie. Excellent compliments you brought, in addition to what Kate in the beginning brought, Greg, Rodrigo, and I think you brought a good wrap up of all the factors that we saw developing. I think you put it in a very interesting way, the pillars from your perspective. And I think we come now to a very important moment of the panel, because we have a business leader here who is really hands-on in the transformation of the economy, working in mining for lithium, which is, as we were saying earlier, a fundamental raw material for this transition. Anna, I think there's so much you can share with us about the challenges and about the levers also that you're seeing from what is happening, and maybe you tell us a little bit about how the business, how Sigma is developing, where you're at now, and what is your product, and how this how it is inserted in this overall dynamics. And also, if you could connect back to the point that Greg was saying earlier about financing, this regulatory transformation, how this affects your sector.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, everyone. So for those of you who don't know Sigma is a 9-year-old Canadian company, and for 3 years we've been applying clean technologies at our demonstration plant to scale in Brazil to produce environmentally sustainable lithium materials. These are the materials that are required to build the advanced lithium-ion batteries for cars, for the electrification of cars. We've been quite successful, and as a result, we have in place supply agreements with the largest battery makers in the world. These are direct agreements, namely LG Energy Services, for instance, which basically place these materials inside the cars you all like to drive, General Motors, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Porsche, Audi. This green lithium, I mean, this clean and sustainable lithium is a key material in these new supply chains. They're being formed with the purpose of enabling the electric vehicle industry to not to move the environmental problem from the streets of Europe and the United States towards the regions where the battery materials are mined and processed. So there's an alignment of purpose with between suppliers such as Sigma and the electric car makers to decarbonize at the end, at the downstream, and while preserving the planet's ecosystems, air, water, and land. So it was we met our moment at COP in Glasgow, because this is our second COP. We took center stage in some of these discussions for the development of these new supply chains for this next generation of electric vehicles, which have sustainable supply chains. And we've been at the center of some of these discussions because of our pioneer practices in applying these clean tech, these green technologies to achieve environmental sustainability, and moreover, to develop a circular economy in that region where we operate that will drive social impact in the communities and therefore create more jobs than just the jobs, and more economic impact than just the economic impact created by the company. I think a very interesting day and a good practical example was what happened on Transportation Day. Each day of the COP is dedicated to one of the aspects of climate transition and just transition, as it was said earlier. So Transportation Day was a very interesting day. It was the 10th, because at that day, it was pretty clear that all the points being raised around zero carbon mobility, 2.0 supply chains were 100% aligned with our purpose. So as this pioneer, I mean, I was actually personally actively engaged in some of these closed discussions even, where, for instance, Global Battery Alliance presented their findings on some of the supply chains, metal by metal, and they've done a very thorough work. And it's interesting because there's clearly a focus on alignment in terms of prioritizing decarbonization, I mean, GHG issuance, which is impact on air. But now the analysis of supply chains has gotten a lot more sophisticated. And they're now looking at aspects such as land impact. And in mining, that translates into tailing dams, ecosystem impact. Does that scale with the sector? And water, because as electrification goes to levels that we didn't think were possible, it's almost a quarter of new cars sold in Europe being electric. There's a lot of concern about whether a supplier can scale environmentally. In other words, how big can a tailing dam get, and how much water do these processes use? And is this compatible with 100% electrification? And the discussions were surprisingly very specific. Everyone was very well informed. I mean, in fact, we believe that the consultants, the technical consultants, have been very, very, very well equipped to actually present very precise findings to ministers and to regulators in some of those closed sessions. social impact and social justice, which are translated into what they call just transition, also took center stage. To your point, Rafael, one of the interesting aspects of the main negotiation was about the amount of compensation, where most of the nations they call it the South were basically saying that the number proposed wasn't a fair amount, the publicized 100 billion, right? But moreover, there's a lot of impact on the micro level, on the businesses around social sustainability. I mean, are the companies lifting the region? Is anyone being left behind, right? So in our case, again, we met our moment because we had eight months ago when we were invited for the second time by the UNCC to bring two technical representatives from the Vale do Jequitinhonha, from the towns we are operating. We asked the towns to nominate a technical representative each, so that we could actually expose them to this, amount of information, to drink from the same sources in order to prepare their own plans for the towns to becoming net zero and being able to attract these ancillary industries around circularity and developing more green jobs, right? And it's fascinating because given that we've been real pioneers, we were parties, we were named parties, so we had full access to the blue zone and to the plenary. So these representatives, together with us, had the opportunity to play a very active role in dialoguing with the parties, like the conference of parties, right? And it was a very rich dialogue with people from all over the world, really, on what they're doing to achieve social sustainability for this just energy transition. And for instance, one of the panels I was in had the president of the city council of our host city of Glasgow, which gave the example of Glasgow itself that had witnessed an energy transition away from coal. I mean, Glasgow powered the Industrial Revolution and shared the examples of what they've done. The Prime Minister, our host, a woman as well, Nicola Sturgeon, attended that session. So it was a very rich exchange and dialogue of themes that weren't on the table as technically before. And I think on technical discussions, and again, I'll wear another hat here because I was also sitting there as an investor through A10, the controlling shareholder of Sigma. A lot of focus on metrifying social impact. I mean, again, it's relatively straightforward to metrify E through the life cycle analysis, where you measure quantitatively the impact on GHG by carbon tonnage, water, there are the indexes, and land. So there's a scientific process for measuring the E on ESG. The G is, again, governance, transparency, the stock exchange, a lot of focus on companies becoming publicly traded. There was a lot of pushback on private companies, especially around transparency. So the S became a question mark. How does one metrify social impact? And the metrics of choice are still the ODS, right? The United Nations SDGs. And so the companies became quite sort of specific on how they use the SDGs and divide the SDGs on what they call mission critical and what they call social action SDGs, because you can't address it all. So companies were in the dialogue with investors in the investment COP, which was another day at the conference, were being asked how do they metrify and receiving feedback that they need to pick their SDGs and embrace sort of a focus socially in order to be more effective, right? So that was another interesting development, was the depth of metrification. Why is that? Because that was, for me, actually one of the big surprises of the COP, how the investors themselves are engaged. I mean, clearly, the funding will come from capital markets, from the private sector, from pension funds, and the Climate 100 group was very active. in driving impact because their investors at individual level have given them that mandate. So the amount of funding available is significant. And one of the points actually I made on my closing remark to the investment club as investor was investors are now they're clearly focused on investing with purposing, driving impact, and staying consistent. And now as investors, they need to think about metrification so that they can understand how to measure success, right? So the S comes back to that. It boils down to how to measure success in achieving social goals. So I think that's kind of a summary, but I think one comment, and that's an overall comment from comparing, I think earlier someone was just saying that Madrid was just 2 years ago. It felt like a decade ago in terms of the level of engagement, in terms of the knowledge of the parties involved, in terms of the caliber of the participation of decision makers. I mean, there was a number of CEOs at the conference. One even was saying that it was the cool Davos because it was the Davos of the people who care about the planet. So all of a sudden on second week, a series of CEOs started to descend in Glasgow, just willing to be part of the dialogue, to learn, to educate themselves. So week 2 became quite interesting. As you can tell, half the conference was in Edinburgh because so many people just decided to go, right? So it's a sign of clear progress. But more importantly, it's a sign that there's an enormous knowledge base now that shifted from the NGOs, who have always been incredibly knowledge, but they were just pushed aside in the past. But now they're fully embraced by investors, and in turn, forcing companies to adhere, to be consistent, to do their homework, right? Because a lot of companies just didn't do the homework. They were part of these supply chains, and some of them were completely inconsistent with the purpose of supply chains where they were in. So I think it was a moment of truth for a lot of businesses, and for us, it was very gratifying to be part of this and meet our moment.
Ana, fantastic to have your testimony about it, and from an investor and operator perspective. We are a little over our time, but it was so contentful to have the snapshots from all of you. I know Natalie has to run to the airport. Rodrigo also is on the verge of another event, and so much to catch up. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for that. And the transversal aspect of the S, of the social dimension of the overall sustainability of what we're talking. I think beyond the SDGs, we need to think of what is already established by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation in Europe, the EU taxonomy in Europe, several mandates already at national level, which is the fulfillment of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I think not many companies are fulfilling their duty of pursuing the due diligences on human rights, following the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines. And what we see is that companies are very agile in terms of picking and choosing a couple of SDGs, but sometimes are not managing their risks and impacts, or the risks and impacts of rights holders in the territory where they are operating. So I think that is also a very important starting point for responsible companies internationally, and capital is increasingly concerning and putting that as a precondition by regulatory efforts and also by good practice. So with that, thank you again so much for your participation, for taking these minutes out of your busy agendas. And let me shift over to Carolina to close this event. And thank you all for following this event. Carolina.
Thank you, Rafa. Thank you, Rodrigo, Ana, Natalie, and then Katie and Greg that had to leave us. Again, this was a very last minute event that we put together, but I'm glad that we did because there's so much insight, so much information that was shared here today. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here and for the availability to have this discussion. So I would like to thank again all our guests that join us today. And as well, of course, like can not mention our sponsors, Vale, Export Development Canada, Sescom Barrier, Brookfield Lundin Mining, and TMX for the support, and our partners for the discussion, of course, Proactiva with Rafael, Benke, McKenzie with Greg for making this possible, and then, of course, Sigma, Agroicone, and Instituto Talanoa. So thank you so much. And stay safe, everyone. Have a great Wednesday. Thank you for being here. And I hope to see some of you guys at our PDAC discussions that are coming up in March, that I think a lot of this that can be brought to the discussions in March for the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada conference that we'll be hosting in person in Toronto. So I'm excited to see you all, or some of you in person here. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate. Thank you, Rafa, for putting this together. And I'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.